So when I was in Sunday school, and I suspect I was reasonably young because this was actually attractive to me, my Sunday school teacher really wanted us to memorize John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but have eternal life. This is sort of the good news of God's love all wrapped up in one useful sentence, and she wanted us to have that in our hearts. And so she knew how to motivate us, and that was shiny objects. She got walnut shells from her yard, I don't know, maybe they were from the store, but I suspect they were from the yard. And she got gold spray paint, and she sprayed them gold and shiny. And she said, this verse is the gospel in a nutshell. Right? It's sort of this perfect package of the good news of God's love. And if you can get that memorized, you can have a golden nutshell. And that was all it took. Boy, I wanted a golden nutshell, so I memorized it. I don't know what happened to the nutshell. It was probably thrown in the bottom of a drawer rather immediately. But it was so important, she thought, for us to have these words of God's love in our heart that she went to all that putsy trouble of painting nutshells so that we would be motivated to learn. And we do that. We ask our young people in Sunday school to try to memorize this verse. And we often see it around out in life, sometimes as graffiti even on an underpass. You might see it on a sign at a sporting event. A hamburger place on the West Coast where I grew up has Bible verses printed on the bottom of their cups. And if you flip over, you'll see John 3:16. And maybe sometimes it feels like a secret code among Christians, but the purpose is to remind folks of God's love. And so here we get to this opportunity to preach on this passage, and I'm reading along, and I start to squirm. Because there's a little more in here than just that verse, isn't there? It's great. We hear about God's love that is bigger than we can imagine. God's love that is big for the cosmos is the word for world there. It's everything. God's love for everything was so intense that God sent God's Son into the world so that we could trust ourselves to him, that we could believe in him. That's great. And then in verse 17, God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Good, better than good. And then we get to verse 18. Those who believe in him are not condemned, but those who do not believe are condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people love darkness rather than light. Suddenly, we are pretty well into condemnation and pretty well into judgment. And this language of perishing starts to sound pretty severe. And it hits on that problem that we have. When we understand, or we begin to understand, the immensity and the depth of God's love, then we have this question about, so what about this language of rejecting God? And John, in his gospel, and his community is in a place and a time where they are trying to define themselves, and John wants to use clear language to make his point. So how do we square John 3:16, this declaration of the power and the depth and the purpose of God's saving love, with what sounds like, in 2 verses later, a big, and woe to you who didn't listen? Right? It can feel that way, and if it's not in this passage, there are other portions of Scripture that can hit us that way. And we wonder, how is it that we can square this? Well, that line, love darkness rather than light, got me thinking a bit. Last spring, and I think it was spring because I remember taking the entire season of shorts and not pants to heal. I had been... I'd been waiting for spring for a really long time. It was probably May by the time this happened. The sun was shining, and I went for a walk, and it was great. I'm walking along just on the sidewalk and listening to my podcast and just doing my thing, and then suddenly I'm flat on my face. And, you're sort of surprised. I didn't really notice it happening. All of a sudden, I was just down, and, you look in your hands. I still have a few little dots from where there were little stones in my hands, and you kind of get the sense that if I look down, it's going to be kind of messy. And my pants were done for, my knees were done for, and I had 20 minutes to walk home before I could really do anything about it. So I kind of hobble home feeling pretty sorry for myself, because after a certain age, you really expect to stay vertical. And it's sort of a wound to your pride, but it was a pretty good wound to my knees as well. And I get home, and there's my couch. And I've done the hard work of hobbling back. I didn't call anybody for a ride, or, I'm feeling bad for myself. I'd just like to sit down and put my feet up, but I know that there's blue jeans in my knees. There's little rocks in my knees. There's all kinds of dirt in my knees, and there's a blood everywhere. So I really need to go and take care of this, because if I let it dry, it's going to be even worse, right? But I don't want to go in that bathroom, and I do not want to pick little bits out of my knee. I know it's not good to have rocks in my skin, but I know that solving my problem is going to involve a lot of poking around in something pretty painful until I get to that place where it can heal well. And so it's tempting to put it off. If you're under the age of 10, you're allowed to run screaming from the room, right? But as an adult, I didn't even have anybody to drag me back into the bathroom, so I needed to just go ahead and do this. And that language that John uses about those who do not believe are condemned already, that kind of makes me squirm, I think is like that. Whenever we choose to live with the rocks and the dirts and the bits of old blue jean in our knees, instead of dealing with what it takes to be healed, we are already inviting trouble, right? When I am so anxious to keep those little special treasures of rocks in my skin, instead of dealing with it, I am committing to keeping all the bacteria and all the nasty stuff that's in there with it, right? It's not, that God is going to smite me because of my sin. My sin already carries with it all the punishment that you need, right? It's already there. I am trusting in something that's not healthy, and that is going to hurt me. I am living with a wound that I haven't cared for. That is going to hurt me. There will be an infection. It's not punishment. It's just the consequence of not picking the rocks out of my knee. And that phrase, folks who have not believed in Jesus, when we haven't trusted in Jesus, because we like the darkness, because we wanted to trust in something else, because we keep trusting in the things we know will fail us, I think that's what John is talking about. When we ask how to square a God whose love takes the shape of ultimate sacrifice with the idea of condemnation, I think what we have to understand is that language of condemnation is not prescriptive. It's not a threat. If you do that, God's going to smite you. Don't think that's what it is. I think what it is describing reality. We are already in trouble. If I keep my bloody knee without cleaning it, I'll have an infection. If I shrink back into the dark, instead of welcoming the light that is going to bring healing and new life in my life, because it's more comfortable in the dark, right? And I don't want to poke around at those uncomfortable spots in my life, I'm going to lose out on real life. If I opt to trust the habits of sin and the powers of this world that I know are going to fail me, again, you probably know those things in your life, we're going to lose out on the real life that God came to bring, that Jesus was sent to give us. When John speaks about condemnation, it's not a threat. It's just describing what we're missing. Through this season of Lent, we've been talking about the cost of following Jesus. What does it cost us to follow Jesus? And I think today the answer is it costs us our treasured weaknesses and injuries and our trust in the things that fail us again and again. All those little rocks and pebbles and splinters that we don't want to deal with because it's uncomfortable, that are eventually going to do us so much more harm than good. They are not treasures, right? And yet we protect them and we want to keep them. I ran across a little, whatever you call those things. It's like bumper stickers on Facebook. People put little quotes up. And there was one this week that caught me. It said, once a man was asked, what did you gain by praying regularly? What did you get out of it? And the man answered, well, nothing. But let me tell you what I lost. Anger, ego, greed, depression, insecurity, and fear of death. Sometimes the answer to our prayers, he said, isn't gaining, but losing. All of those things that we tend to nurture so carefully, those wounds that we don't want to look at because, it's true, dealing with them is going to be uncomfortable. We prevent ourselves from receiving that gift of healing and new life that comes in Jesus. The cost of following Jesus is welcoming the light, is welcoming the healing and the new life, and is welcoming the tweezers that are going to come and relieve us. The cost of following Jesus is nothing more or nothing less than trusting him instead of running back into the darkness that's already killing us. At the 9:30 service, we have more kids because they're not off in Sunday school, and so I got to do kids' time, and I got to read them my favorite book ever. It's called The Runaway Bunny. And I didn't know about this when I was a child, even though it's by the same woman who wrote Goodnight Moon. And I didn't know about it when our kids were in the age where you have to give them these kind of books because they eat paper. But when I did find it, I was just so excited. So it's a story about a little bunny, and he tells his mother, he says, I am running away. And then it's a story about what happens. He tells his mother that he's running away, and she says, that's okay, I will run after you. And he says, oh yeah, well, I'm going to turn into a fish, and she promises to come and catch him in the stream. He says, oh yeah, well, I'm going to turn into a rock, and she says, well, then I'll be a mountain climber, and I'll come find you. And I'm going to turn into a flower, I'll be a gardener, over and over again. All of the ways that he might run away from her love, and the ways that she says, I'm going to love you anyhow. I'm going to find you. I'm going to care for you. You've got to join the circus. That's fine. I'll be a tightrope walker right alongside you. And finally he says, I guess I will become a boy and run into the house. And she says, if you become a little boy and run into a house, I will become your mother and catch you in my arms and hug you. And at that point he says, well, phooey, I guess I don't need to run away. There's no point. But this idea of God going to any length, right? That's why I love this story so much. I can hardly read it to my kids without being a sniveling mess, because that is the love of God, right? That I am going to come and I'm going to find you, rocks in your knees, in the darkness, and I'm going to come and sit next to you, and I'm going to change that, right? If you have been a parent of a child with a splinter, you know you're not going to let them be if it looks bad. Right? They're the kinds you can ignore, and they're the kinds where you know you need to take this out so that it doesn't get infected. And if I know it's that way, I'm going to try 370 different tactics to get my tweezers and that hand in the same place. I will wheedle, and I will whine, and I will bribe, and I will hold the hand still, whatever it takes. I'm going to keep trying until I can get that splinter out. I don't want my child to get sick. God doesn't leave us the first time we want to run away, right? My kid, the first time he says, no, you may not pull this sliver, I don't give up. The first time we say, oh, but the darkness is better, God doesn't say, well, then stick with it, buddy. God doesn't leave us the first time or the second time or the third time. You get the idea, right? Like that mama who is going to go after her little bunny no matter what, God comes for us again and again and again. God's way of loving the world was to send the Son to save it. The light comes to find us, to light up our path, to bring that healing and that hope, no matter what. Now, from living a life of real faith, you might know this. It's not an orderly process. John here, who wrote this gospel, really wanted to communicate clearly, and he liked black and white language, right? These people listened, those people didn't. The reality is a little bit more complicated. The truth of the matter is we're all over the place, all at once. We are constantly shifting in how well we are trusting God. We're shifting in our willingness to allow the light to shine on the fullness of our lives and not just the part we've already kind of gotten together. We shift in our ability to notice and recognize and celebrate the healing that comes from letting the light shine on us, and on our willingness to let go of our splinters or keep them, right? Trusting in Jesus isn't a one-shot deal, where if you've missed it, you're gone, you're out of luck. And if you get it, you're done, and you're free to gloat. Life is messy and it's complicated, and we are saints and sinners at the same time, and that is the human life that Jesus came to join us in. We know that the love of God has the last word. We know the end of the story, but in the meantime, it is complicated. So we don't have, I hope, any sort of delusion that church is where we come to be perfect. This is where we come to kind of show each other our splinters. Do you ever do that? I've been known to, actually just yesterday I got one, and it was right where my hand was bending, and so I couldn't really use my hand well, but I thought maybe it wasn't deep enough that I needed to putz with it. It wasn't coming out easily. And so at some point you kind of go to your spouse or someone else and you say, what do you think? Do I need to do something about this? And you probably know the answer if you're asking, right? Church is that place for us where we can come to one another and say, what do you think? Is there hope for this? Do I need to tend to this? Can you help me with this? It's the place where we show each other our splinters, where we assure each other that God can indeed deal with this, whatever this might be. Place where we come to remind ourselves then what to do when that splinter's out. What are my hands good for when they actually work? Right? What are my hands and my knees meant for, and my life, my whole self, meant for when I don't have those unhealthy things that I'm trusting in, those bits that are stuck in me, that are keeping me from doing what I've been made to do? Did you hear what Paul said? He said, we are what God has made us, created in Christ Jesus for good works which God prepared beforehand to be our way of life. We have a calling. We have a gift. We have ministries to do with our hands and our feet once they are working. And because things are all tossed up together in a life of faith, we have a calling to go ahead and use those hands and feet even when they're not quite there yet. Because sometimes it's in that process of sharing God's love and of using what we've been given that we begin to recognize what it really is that we've been given. And we begin to recognize the ways that we can heal and grow. And so we're called in church to show each other our splinters, to be the good news that God can deal with that, and then to model for each other and to encourage and rile each other up to sharing what we have been given, using our hands for what they were meant to do, for loving our neighbor. Later on at our offering time, we're going to hear from folks who have been involved in our men's shelter ministry and their opportunity to invite us to join in because of what they have experienced, the ways that they have experienced just jumping in to be a place where God is actually at work already in their lives. So as we sit and ponder, as we plan to sing, there's a wideness in God's mercy, I encourage you to give thanks for this place where we can do this all together.